Welcome back to Pause to Unedit Yourself, a podcast where reflection meets transformation, where we explore the art of becoming one intentional pause at a time. I'm your host, Anushka, and each episode offers you a chance to press pause and explore bite sized insights and soulful reflections from my own journey of introspection in the hope it will help you too on your path of personal evolution. Whether you're feeling stuck, seeking clarity, or simply wanting to expand, my hope is that this becomes a space of inspiration and deep remembering, guiding you to evolve from within and uncover the infinite potential that lives inside each and every one of you. Your time is valuable, it's the most precious commodity. So, once again, thank you for being here and sharing this space with me. And thank you for pressing pause and choosing to journey inward and daring to become the highest expression of yourself. Today, I wanted to sort of deep dive into some beliefs that shape how we see ourselves and others. And that is around shame, guilt, and judgment. So let's start with something very simple to shift the perspective. Okay, here's a question. Do we actually see reality as it is, or do we see reality as we are? You see, people don't see reality as it is, they see reality as they are. And once I understood this, my perspective in life has really shifted because every perception is filtered through a belief, a memory, an experience. All of our perceptions, they're shaped by our beliefs, our experiences, our wounds, our nervous system. And so what we see in the world, it's often a mirror, but it's not the truth. It's of our internal state. So, with that in mind, when someone judges you, when somebody misunderstands you or projects onto you, we often take that experience and it hurts us. And we start thinking that there is something wrong with us. But if you shift that and you see that that isn't actually a reflection of your worth, but instead it's a reflection of their inner world. And what you're witnessing from their actions and their words and their behaviors is actually you're witnessing a reflection of their internal state. And yes, of course, that doesn't mean that judgment doesn't hurt. Of course, you feel it. We're all humans, right? But it doesn't mean it isn't personal in the way that we actually think it is. And when we understand this, it starts to become the most liberating shifts that we can make. Let's start by exploring shame, the belief that something is wrong with me. And how does it take root? This is something that I've explored for quite a while. Let's start by defining what actually is shame. So, more often than not, we think that shame is that feeling, bad about something that we've done. In actual fact, that's not shame, that's guilt. Shame is deeper. It's not the same as guilt. And here's the way to understand it. Guilt says I did something wrong, so you're guilty of it. Whereas shame says I am something wrong. There is something wrong with me. See that difference? And this belief of shame often starts it from an early age, often rooted in rejection or the fear of it. And for many of us, earlier, especially in early life, rejection, when you get rejected, doesn't, it didn't just hurt. Think about when you might have been rejected when you were younger, going through your teenage years, if you liked a boy or a girl and they didn't like you back, um, or any kind of rejection, like when you're with your friendship groups and people, when you're growing up, you would have, I remember like having groups, being like the cool kid. And if you're not cool enough, you'd be rejected, right? So that kind of rejection, it actually, you feel ostracized. It's as though being unwanted. It kind of confirmed all of those stories, that I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, I'm not safe. So, because we don't have a way of managing those emotions, we adapted and we shape ourselves into what feels acceptable. And that's when that people pleasing comes into it, or we start performing, we start becoming impressive or helpful, quiet, agreeable, or perfect. All of these things take shape in form of a mask, masking our authenticity. And over time, we start to call that version of ourselves me. We start identifying itself ourselves with me. And we start to shape ourselves into what feels acceptable. And then we call that version me. And that me is that performance, how we perform for the outside world just to fit in, because we don't want to feel that shame. We don't want to feel not being lovable or not being worthy. You try and just fit in. And so that ends up becoming that version of us trying to earn love instead of just being it. But here's the truth: rejection doesn't wound your true self. So it creates this false identity you built to earn love. And what actually heals shame isn't becoming like bulletproof or rejection proof. It's actually becoming self honest and telling the truth about who you are, what you want, how deeply you long for love. And it's about staying true to yourself, even if it scares people. Because what's left is something so much deeper than acceptance, and that is self residence. And this journey of reflection, I mean, we're so much in that zone of just doing constantly, constantly, without actually taking that pause to reflect. Sometimes you see people and they're just unable to reflect, because part of it also is that shame becomes a survival strategy. So let me put that into context. So, for example, if you believed I am not worthy of being loved, then how do you kind of live your life? You might start to overachieve, you strive for perfection, you avoid vulnerability, you shapeshift to belong in circles that you want to fit into, even though it's not who you are. Um, and that's one of the things I used to do when I was younger. I think we all do. We want to find that sense of belonging. You might have this fear of being fully seen, and it's in this way that this shame, it becomes this protective mechanism, and it keeps you performing constantly, keeps you in this controlled mechanism, and it keeps you being acceptable. So when somebody is deeply filled with shame, that self-reflection, it really, really feels so dangerous because it means sitting and doing that inner work and really reflecting on those wounds, and opening those wounds up. And this is why when you ask somebody to be accountable, it can feel very threatening to someone who's filled with shame because taking that accountability, it really means turning inward. And for someone whose core belief is, I am unlovable, feels absolutely unbearable because it will mean that you would have to touch that very belief that says, if I look too closely, I'm going to collapse. It's literally looking at yourself in that mirror and looking at that reflection and peeling back all of those layers. So shame then ends up becoming this defense mechanism. And instead of reflecting in the mirror, some people end up deflecting. Instead of owning, start blaming. Instead of feeling, you start hardening. And I think it's hard for people to journey inwards. And it's not because they don't care, it's because looking within, it does feel like an emotional collapse. So it's a nervous system response. And there's something that I realized is that it's a really important thing to remember is that we can't force anyone to take accountability. We can only decide what we will and won't accept is something important to understand. So let's now shift gears into judgment and comparison. Carl Jung once said, thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. And I sat with this for quite a while. I think judgment is it's often a shortcut, isn't it? It's easy to judge, to criticize. And there's a difference between constructive feedback and criticism because it's easy to put labels on someone. It feels safer, like if you put a label on someone and you judge them. And it really comes down to how the ego it protects itself. And I think it was episode 21 and 22 where I did a massive big deep dive into the ego. The ego, it really loves these, it craves these tidy conclusions, of labels. The opposite of judgment is that if we release that need to judge, what happens is that we can end up witnessing every living soul, every human has an evolving story. How beautiful would that be? So instead of actually staying present and opening our hearts, the ego, it really prefers that certainty because those labels, it feels safer than curiosity. But you might be saying, but I never judge. Okay, so let me ask you this. How often do we define people by fragments, by a moment, by a reaction, by a single behavior? And that we forget that they actually have this whole inner world that exists beneath the surface. How often do we how often do we just see people on a surface level and pass a judgment on who they are, how they are, based on their color of the skin, on their ethnicity, the way they look. We've all been there. We've all done it. And to understand someone without judging them, it's really rare and a powerful gift because it's human nature, right? And this is the whole idea is to develop that awareness that we are doing something that is being judgmental. Because too often our ego is always in a rush and we want to define people by what we see, forgetting that there is an infinite soul that lies beyond that narrow viewpoint of them that we have just formed. Because behind every face, there is love and there is loss. Behind every face, there is triumph and regret. There's longing and then there is fear. Every single person you meet carries memories behind their eyes. They have burdens in their laughter. This unspoken longing beneath their smiles. Every person. Just think of yourself and then think of everyone else. And when we judge too quickly, we don't just misunderstand them, we're poking a heart that's already healing. And so choosing not to judge, it is an act of courage because it means that we have to give up that ego's need to be right and step into curiosity instead, and not to just to accept anything at face value. And here's something that I learned actually is that when we stop judging others, we inadvertently start to stop judging ourselves as well. Which then now leads me on to the next part, which is comparison. And we've all heard the saying, comparison is the thief of all joy. So, what does that mean? Like, what happens when you compare yourself to others? Well, if you're thinking about it, every time you compare yourself, it always pulls your awareness outwards. Start shifting your focus outwards instead of inward because you're looking at how somebody else is living their lives or what somebody else is doing, what somebody else has that you don't have. Oh, they have a big house, they have a big car. Looking at their quality of life, and you start just looking externally rather than internally. But when you pause and you remind yourself that every single soul has a unique path, has their own purpose, that we're all different, we're all unique, and we all have our own life purpose and our own timing. And so that minute that you compare yourself to someone else, in that moment, you abandon yourself. I've been exploring many kind of spiritual teachings, and a lot of them say that your soul has a unique path and purpose. And when you compare yourself to others, what happens is that you disconnect from your own light and diminish your appreciation from your journey, because that comparison, it feeds the ego, and that ego is doubt, right? It fuels that doubt. Because then you start thinking, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy enough. I'm not lovable. It blocks gratitude because true growth, it doesn't come from measuring yourself against others and their timelines. How are you going to grow if you do that? You're constantly going to be looking at what somebody else has got, what somebody else is doing. How are you going to grow in that instance? You can't. You have your own path. And so you have to align with your own inner truth, because that's, in a sense, is when judgment, it turns inward, and that's when the suffering begins. I like this quote by Peter Crone, who says that it's not your circumstances that create suffering, it's actually your view of life. And when self judgment becomes unbearable, many people seek to escape, in through work, substance abuse, distractions, or overachievement. And the root isn't the failure, it's the precursor to your childhood where you had established some sense of worthlessness, that you are inadequate. And that's still driving your identity. So, one of the things is a word that has come up quite a lot actually now is is discernment. And there is a difference between judgment and discernment. They sit on the same spectrum, but they come from very different places. So when people say to use your discernment, what does it mean? So judgment would say, I am better than you. Whereas discernment would say, this is not in resonance with my values or nervous system. Discernment is self referenced, whereas judgment is other referenced. So, like, judgment makes it about them, and discernment makes it about me and what I value. I think that's a key thing that I've learned is that, you need to use your discernment to be a filter and not a sponge. Don't absorb everything that's thrown your way. Discern what deserves a space in your mind. And finally, how do we know the difference between ego and awareness? Anything that kind of labels, judges, and controls is the ego. And any part which observes is awareness. Awareness doesn't rush to conclusions, it watches patterns, it observes. And we often fall into this trap of putting people into neat boxes, good or bad, trustworthy or not, without realizing that the real truth isn't in the label, but it's in the patterns. And it's not about judging someone's reputation or first impression. It's about observing their behavior over time. And one of the things that I've thought about is actually, have you ever wondered who you are in other people's memories? And this came about for me because, you meet people, family members, friends after many years, and, they all pass a comment, oh, you haven't changed, or, you used to be like this, or you don't go out as much, and I thought you were a party animal, all of those kind of things. And you're thinking, oh, hold on a second. Who are you in those people's memories? Because of course time has passed, you've evolved, you've grown. And to someone you might be the light of their day. To another you are the one who disappointed them. To someone you might be fearless in one story, and somebody somebody else's you might be somebody who was very careful. Each person holds fragments of you from a brief moment in time. You exist as different characters and stories, and your strength might look like stubbornness to some people. Your passion might feel too intense for others. Your silence might seem distant or thoughtful, depending on who's watching. And when we realize that we scatter pieces of ourselves everywhere, and people keep what resonates for them and their story. And so people are going to judge you based on what version they know and what their ego wants to see. So you can't control their version of you, but you have complete power over who you become tomorrow. Because you really have to understand your real self isn't in their stories, it's in the choices you make when no one is looking. And so instead of rushing to define a person, watch how they move, how they treat others when no one is looking, how they show up when things get hard. Because the character, it's not in a title, but it's in the trail that they leave behind. So before I leave you today, sit with this prompt and think about it. Where in my life am I judging instead of listening? Sit with that, because that awareness alone begins to soften that belief that we have. And it's in that softening that's when the freedom starts. As always, these episodes are as much reminders for me as they are offerings for you, little moments of recalibration. you can return to whenever you need. And if this resonated for you, please feel free to save it, share it with someone who may need it, and let me know what landed for you. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. And remember, you are not broken, you are becoming. See you on the next episode.